welcome to our daily Prophecy Reformation program. We will be doing this live 4 days a week. In the middle of the week, Wednesday, I'm going to do a full hour on prophecy and history, as I have been doing. But on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, we're going to do what I'm doing today. And we're going to be reading through, or I'm going to be reading through, the history of Protestantism, and of course starting with Volume 1. If you'd like to buy a copy of this, you can go to my website, and you can, there's a link there in my free bookstore tab, and that's at nicklasarthur.wordpress.com. Click on the free bookstore tab there, and it'll take you. There's no free volume available there, but I will link one there because I know archive.org has it. But if you have a notion to buy one, make sure that you buy one from us. And I'm the only one who's printed it and republished it in 5 volumes, putting all of the block prints back into. I know that others have. There's a 3-volume set out there that others are selling, and they don't have the block prints in it. And actually, they cost more than I separated it into 5 volumes because I wanted to add all the pictures, and there's hundreds of pages of the original block prints, and I wanted to put them all back in, and they were all remastered. Some of them needed to be remastered and fixed, but they've all been added back in, and I wanted to make them not too heavy. So as you can see, they're all about 500 pages, 400 to 500 pages each, and 5 volumes. But like I said, they cost less than the 3 volumes that are being offered by others to buy the 5 volumes with all of the block prints in them. I priced them fairly low, much lower, so you're going to have to pay quite a bit more to get the 3 volumes, and you will not get as quality a product with all of the original block prints placed back into the text where they belong, approximately where they were in the text before. Being on a different format, it's hard to get all these things as they were before, unless you print out the PDF, but there's quality issues with that always. So, because I know that some people have printed out the PDF and printed them and sold them that way, but it takes a lot more pages because you can get a lot more print with modern typesetting than you can just printing the old texts. You almost get 2 pages of the old text, about 1 2/3 pages of the old text on 1 page with modern typesetting makes it a lot easier. And that's what you're looking at on the screen. This is the PDF of what is actually in those printed editions. But archive.org, if you want it for free, it's there at archive.org. Just put in James A. Wylie, and you'll see that everything that James A. Wylie has written, and there's nothing that James A. Wylie, our author, has not written that is not worthwhile. So anyway, James A. Wylie, and this was written about 1879, as you can see from the date there. Let's see, I'm going to leave the foreword out since I wrote that for these volumes. And we're going to go straight to chapter 1. Actually, a little bit more about James A. Wylie's the book here. It actually is made up of several books. All of the books have been put together here. Each book is called Book First, Book Second, up to, I don't know exactly how many books there are. Let me take a look for a second. Let me get the book 24th. I think book 24. So it's made up of 24 books. So in case anyone was wondering, in 5 volumes, 24 books. And so each one here, we have one, has the first first book is Progress from the 1st century to the 14th century. Book second is Wycliffe and his times of advent of Protestantism. And the book third is John Huss and the Hussite Wars, and the history continues like that in 24 books to fill up all 5 volumes. So we're not going to go through each one right now, but you'll see. And this is one of the block prints here I put on the page at the end of the table of contents. And here's the opening. I exactly copied the way that the block print was put into the book on this first page, how it fills the top and goes down one side. And this is where we begin. Book first. Progress from the 1st century to the 14th century. Chapter 1. Protestantism. And with each chapter you get a subtitle of the chapter outlining what is in that chapter. Okay? So we have Protestantism, the seat of arts, letters, free states, etc., its history, a grand drama, its origin, outside humanity, a great creative power, Protestantism, revived Christianity. The history of Protestantism, which we propose to write, is no mere history of dogmas. The teachings of Christ are the seeds. The modern Christendom, with its new life, is the godly tree which has sprung from them. We shall speak of the seed, then of the tree, so small at its beginning, but destined one day to cover the earth. How that seed was deposited in the soil, how the tree grew up and nourished despite the furious tempests that warred around it, how, century after century, it lifted its top higher in heaven, and spread its boughs wider around, sheltering liberty, nursing letters, fostering art, and gathering a fraternity of prosperous and powerful nations around it. It will be our business in the following pages to show. Meanwhile, we wish to be noted that this is what we understand by the Protestantism on the history of which we are now entering. Viewed thus, and any narrow view would be untrue alike to philosophy and to fact. The history of Protestantism is the record of one of the grandest dramas of all time. It is true, no doubt, that Protestantism, strictly viewed, is simply a principle. It is not a policy. It is not an empire, having its fleets and armies, its officers and tribunals, wherewith to extend its dominion and make its authority be obeyed. It is not even a church with its hierarchies and synods and edicts. It is simply a principle, but it is the greatest of all principles. It is a creative power. Its plastic influence is all-embracing. It penetrates into the heart and renews the individual. It goes down to the depths, and by its omnipotent but noiseless energy, vivifies and regenerates society. It thus becomes the creator of all that is true and lovely and great, the founder of free kingdoms, and the mother of pure churches. The globe itself it claims as a stage not too wide for the manifestation of its beneficent action, and the whole domain of terrestrial affairs it deems a sphere not too vast to fill with its spirit and rule by its law. Whence came this principle? The name Protestantism is very recent. The thing itself is very ancient. The term Protestantism is scarcely older than 350 years. It dates from the protest which the Lutheran princes gave in to the Diet at Spires in 1529. Restricted to its historical signification, Protestantism is purely negative. It only defines the attitude taken up at a great historical era by one party in Christendom with reference to another party. But had this been all, Protestantism would have had no history. Had it been purely negative, it would have begun and ended with the men who assembled at the German town in the year already specified. The new world that has come out of it is the proof that at the bottom of this protest was a great principle which it has pleased Providence to fertilize and make the seed of those grand, beneficent, and enduring achievements which have made the past 3 centuries in many respects, 4 centuries now, in many respects the most eventful and wonderful in history. The men who handed in this protest did not wish to create a mere void. If they disowned the creed and threw off the yoke of Rome, it was that they might plant a purer faith and restore the government of a higher law. They replaced the authority of the infallibility with the authority of the Word of God. The long and dismal obscuration of centuries they dispelled, that the twin stars of liberty and knowledge might shine forth, and that, conscience being unbound, the intellect awake awake from its deep somnolence, and human society, renewing its youth, might, after its halt of 1,000 years, resume its march towards its high goal. We repeat the question, whence came this principle? And we ask our readers to mark well the answer, for it is the keynote to the whole of our vast subject, and places us at the very outset, at the springs of that long narration on which we are now entering. Protestantism is not solely the outcome of human progress. It is no mere principle of perfectibility inherent in humanity, and ranking as one of its native powers, in virtue of which, when society becomes corrupt, it can purify itself, and when it is arrested in its course by some external force, or stops from exhaustion, it can recruit its energies and set forward anew on its path. It is neither the product of the individual reason, nor the result of the joint thought and energies of the species. Protestantism is a principle which has its origin outside human society. It is a divine graft on the intellectual and moral nature of man, whereby new vitalities and forces are introduced into it, and the human stem yields henceforth a nobler fruit. It is the descent of a heaven-born influence which allies itself with all the instincts and powers of the individual, and all the laws and cravings of society, and which, quickening both the individual and the social being into a new life, and redirecting their efforts to nobler objects, permits the highest development of which humanity is capable, and the fullest possible accomplishment of all its grand ends. In a word, Protestantism is revived Christianity. Chapter 2. Decline of the early church. Decline of the early Christian church. Early triumphs of the truth. Causes. The 4th century. Early simplicity lost. The church remodeled on the pattern of the empire. Disputes regarding Easter Day. Descent of the Gothic nations. Introduction of pagan rites into the church. Acceleration of corruption. Inability of the world all at once to receive the gospel in its greatness. All through from the 5th to the 15th century, the lamp of truth burned dimly in the sanctuary of Christendom. Its flame often sank low and appeared about to expire, yet never did it wholly go out. God remembered his covenant with the light and set bounds to the darkness. Not only had this heaven-kindled lamp its period of waxing and waning, like those luminaries that God has placed on high, but like them too, it had its appointed circuit to accomplish. Now it was on the cities of northern Italy that its light was seen to fall, and now its rays illumined the plains of southern France. Now it shone along the course of the Danube and the Moldau, and tinted the pale shores of England, or shed its glory on the Scottish Hebrides. Now it was on the summits of the Alps that it was seen to burn, spreading gracious morning on the mountain-tops, and giving promise of the sure approach of day. And then, anon, it would bury itself in the deep valleys of Piedmont, and seek shelter from the furious tempests of persecution behind the great rocks and the eternal snows of the everlasting hills. Let us briefly trace the growth of this truth to the days of Wycliffe. The spread of Christianity during the first 3 centuries was rapid and extensive. The main causes that contributed to this were the translation of the Scriptures into the language of the Roman world, the fidelity and zeal of the preachers of the gospel, and the heroic deaths of the martyrs. It was the success of Christianity that first set limits to its progress. It had received a terrible blow, it is true, under Diocletian. This, which was the most terrible of all the early persecutions, had, in the belief of the pagans, utterly exterminated the Christian superstition. So far from this, it had but afforded the gospel an opportunity of giving to the world a mightier proof of its divinity. It rose from the stakes and massacres of Diocletian to begin a new career, in which it was destined to triumph over the empire which thought that it had crushed it, that thought it had crushed. Was destined to triumph over the empire which thought that it had crushed it. Dignities and wealth now flowed in upon its ministers and disciples, and according to the uniform testimony of all the early historians, the faith which had maintained its purity and vigor in the humble sanctuaries and lowly position of the first age, and amid the fires of its pagan persecutors, became corrupt and waxed feeble amid the gorgeous temples and the worldly dignities which imperial favor had lavished upon it. From the 4th century, the corruptions of the Christian Church continued to make marked and rapid progress. The Bible began to be hidden from the people, and in proportion as the light, which is the surest guarantee of liberty, was withdrawn, the clergy usurped authority over the members of the Church. The canons and councils were put in the room of the one infallible rule of faith, and thus the first stone was laid in the foundations of Babylon, that great city that made all the nations to drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The ministers of Christ began to effect titles of dignity and to extend their authority and jurisdiction to temporal matters, forgetful that an office bestowed by God and serviceable to the highest interests of society can never fail of respect when filled by men of exemplary character, sincerely devoted to the discharge of its duties. The beginning of this matter seemed innocent enough. To obviate pleas before the secular tribunals, ministers were frequently asked to arbitrate in disputes between members of the Church, and Constantine made a law confirming all such decisions in the consistories of the clergy, and shutting out the review of their sentences by civil judges. Proceeding on this fatal path, the next step was to form the external polity of the Church upon the model of civil government. 4 vice-kings or prefects governed the Roman Empire under Constantine, and why, it was asked, should not a similar arrangement be introduced into the Church? Accordingly, the Christian world was divided into 4 great dioceses. Over each diocese was set a patriarch, who governed the whole clergy of his domain, and thus arose 4 great thrones or princedoms in the house of God. Where there had been a brotherhood, there was now a hierarchy, and from the lofty chair of the patriarch, a gradation of rank and subordination of authority and office ran down to the lowly state and contracted sphere of the presbyter. It was splendor of rank rather than the fame of learning and the luster of virtue that henceforward conferred distinction on the ministers of the church. Such an arrangement was not fitted to nourish spirituality of mind, or humility of disposition, or peacefulness of temper. The enmity and violence of the persecutor, the clergy had no longer cause to dread. But the spirit of faction, which now took possession of the dignitaries of the church, awakened vehement disputes and fierce contentions, which disparaged the authority and sullied the glory of the sacred office. The emperor himself was witness to these unseemly spectacles. "Entreat you," we find him pathetically saying to the fathers of the Council of Nice, "beloved ministers and servants of our Savior Jesus Christ, take away the cause of our dissension and disagreement. Establish peace among yourselves." While the living oracles were neglected, the zeal of the clergy began to spend itself upon rites and ceremonies borrowed from pagans. These were multiplied to such a degree that Augustine complained that they were less tolerable than the yoke of the Jews under the law. At this period, the Bishop of Rome wore costly attire, gave sumptuous banquets, and when they went abroad were carried in litters. They now began to speak with an authoritative voice, and to demand obedience from all the churches. Of this, the dispute between the Eastern and Western churches respecting Easter is an instance in point. The Eastern Church, which following the Jews, keep the feast on the 14th day of the month of Nisan, the day of the Jewish Passover. The churches of the West, and especially that of Rome, kept Easter on the Sabbath following the 14th day of Nisan. Victor, Bishop of Rome, resolved to put an end to the controversy, and accordingly, sustaining himself sole judge in this weighty point, he commanded all the churches to observe the feast on the same day with himself. The churches of the East, not aware that the Bishop of Rome had authority to command their obedience in this or in any other matter, kept Easter as before. And for this flagrant contempt, as Victor accounted it, of his legitimate authority, he excommunicated them. They refused to obey human ordinance, and they were shut out from the kingdom of the gospel. This was the first real peal of those thunders which were in after times to roll so often and so terribly from the 7 hills. Riches, flattery, deference continued to wait upon the Bishop of Rome. The emperor saluted him as a father. Foreign churches sustained him as a judge in their disputes. Heresiarchs sometimes fled to him for sanctuary. Those who had favors to beg extolled his piety or affected to follow his customs. And it is not surprising that his pride and ambition, fed by continual incense, continued to grow, till at last the presbyter of Rome, from being a vigilant pastor of a single congregation, before whom he went in and out, teaching them from house to house, preaching to them the word of life, serving the Lord with all humility in many tears and temptations that befell him, raised his seat above his equals, mounted the throne of the patriarch, and exercised lordship over the heritage of Christ. The gates of the sanctuary once forced, the stream of corruption continued to flow with ever-deepening volume. The declensions in doctrine and worship were already introduced, had changed the brightness of the church's morning into twilight. The descent of the northern nations, which, beginning in the 5th, continued through several successive centuries, converted that twilight into night. The new tribes had changed their country, but not their superstitions. The And unhappily, there was neither zeal nor vigor in the Christianity of the age to effect their instruction and their genuine conversion. The Bible had been withdrawn. In the pulpit, fable had usurped the place of truth. Holy lives whose silent eloquence might have won upon the barbarians were rarely exemplified, and thus, instead of the church dissipating the superstitions that now encompassed her like a cloud, these superstitions all but quenched her own light. She opened her gates to receive the new peoples as they were. She sprinkled them with the baptism of water. She inscribed their names in her registers. She taught them in their invocations to repeat the titles of the Trinity. But the doctrines of the gospel, which alone can enlighten the understanding, purify the heart, and enrich the life with virtue, she was little careful to inculcate upon them. She folded them within her veil, but they were scarcely more Christian than before, while she was greatly less so. From the 6th century downwards, Christianity was a mongrel system made up of pagan rites revived from classic times, of superstition imported from the forests of northern Germany, and of Christian beliefs and observances which continued to linger in the church from primitive and purer times. The inward power of religion was lost, and it was in vain that men strove to supply its place by the outward form. They nourished their piety not at the living fountains of truth, but with the beggarly elements of ceremonies and relics, of consecrated lights and holy vestments. Nor was it divine knowledge only that was contemned. Men forbear to cultivate letters or practice virtue. Baronius confesses that in the 6th century, few in Italy were skilled in both Greek and Latin. Nay, even Gregory the Great acknowledged that he was ignorant of Greek. The main qualifications of the clergy were that they should be able to read well, sing their matins, know the Lord's Prayer, Psalter, forms of exorcism, and understand how to compute the times of the sacred festivals. Nor were they very sufficient for this, if we may believe the account some have given of them. Musculus says that many of them never saw the Scriptures in all their lives. It would seem incredible, but it is delivered by no less authority than Amana, that an Archbishop of Mainz, lighting upon a Bible and looking into it, expressed himself thus, of a truth, I do not know what book this is, but I perceive everything in it is against us. Apostasy is like the descent of heavy bodies. It proceeds with ever-accelerating velocity. First lamps were lighted at the tombs of martyrs. Next, the Lord's Supper was celebrated at their graves. Next, prayers were offered for them and to them. Next, paintings and images began to disfigure the walls, and corpses to pollute the floors of the churches. Baptism, which apostles required water only to dispense, could not be celebrated without white robes and chrism, milk, honey, and salt. Then came a crowd of church officers whose names and numbers are in striking contrast to the few and simple orders of men who were employed in the first propagation of Christianity. There were subdeacons, acolytes, exorcists, readers, choristers, and porters. And as work must be found for this motley host of laborers, there came to be fasts and exorcisms. There were lamps to be lighted, altars to be arranged, and churches to be consecrated. There was the Eucharist to be carried to the dying, and there were the dead to be buried, for which a special order of men was set apart. When one looked back to the simplicity of early times, it could not but amaze one to think what a cumbrous array of curious machinery and costly furniture was now needed for the service of Christianity. Not more stinging than true was the remark that when the church had golden chalices, she had wooden priests. So far, and through these various stages, the decline of the church proceeded. The point she then reached may be termed as an epochal one. From the line on which she stood, there was no going back. She must advance into new and unknown regions before her, though every step would carry her farther from the simple form and vigorous life of her early days. She had received new impregnation from an alien principle, the same, in fact, from which had sprung the great systems that covered the earth before Christianity arose. This principle could not summarily be extirpated. It must run its course. It must develop itself logically, and having, in the course of centuries, brought its fruits to maturity, it would then, but not until then, perish and pass away. Looking back at this stage to the change which had come over the church, we cannot fail to see that its deepest originating cause must be sought in the inability of the world to receive the gospel in all its greatness. It was a boon too mighty and too free to be easily understood or credited by man. The angels in their midnight song in the vale of Bethlehem had defined it briefly and sublimely: good will to man. Its greatest preacher, the Apostle Paul, had no other definition to give of it. It was not even a rule of life, but grace, the grace of God, and therefore sovereign and boundless. To man fallen and undone, the gospel offered full forgiveness and a complete spiritual renovation, issuing at length in the inconceivable and infinite felicity of the life eternal. But man's narrow heart could not enlarge itself to God's vast beneficence. A good so immense, and so complete in its nature, and so boundless in its extent, he could not believe that God would bestow without money and without price. There must be conditions or qualifications, so he reasoned, and hence it is that the monument inspired men to cease to address us. And hence it is at that moment, and hence it is that the moment inspired men to cease to address us, and that their disciples and scholars take their place, men of apostolic spirit and doctrine, no doubt, but without the direct knowledge of their predecessors. We become sensible of a change, and eclipse has passed upon the exceeding glory of the gospel. As we pass from Paul to Clement, and from Clement to the fathers that succeeded him, we find the gospel becoming less of grace and more of merit. The light wanes as we travel down the patristic road, and remove ourselves further from the apostolic dawn. It continues for some time at least to be the same gospel, but its glory is shown, its mighty force is abated. And we are reminded of the change that seems to pass upon the sun, when after contemplating him in a tropical hemisphere, we see him in a northern sky, where slanting beams, forcing their way through mists and vapors, are robbed of half of their splendor. Seen through the fogs of the patristic age, the gospel scarcely looks the same, which had burst upon the world without a cloud a few centuries before. This disposition, that of making God less free in his gift, and man less dependent in his reception of it, the desire to introduce the element of merit on the side of man, and the element of condition on the side of God, operated at last in opening the door for the pagan principle to creep back into the church. A change of a deadly and subtle kind passed upon the worship. Instead of being the spontaneous thanksgiving and joy of the soul that no more evoked or repaid the blessings which awakened that joy than the odors which the flower exhale are the cause of their growth, or the joy that kindles the heart of man when the sun rises is the cause of his rising. Worship, we say, from being the expression of the soul's emotions, was changed into a rite akin to those of the Jewish temples, and still more akin to those of the Greek mythology, a rite in which lay couched a certain amount of human merit and inherent efficacy, that partly created, partly applied the blessings with which it stood connected. This was the moment when the pagan virus inoculated the Christian institution. This change brought a multitude of others in its train, worship being transformed into sacrifice in which was the element of expiation and purification. The teaching ministry was of course converted into a sacrificing priesthood. When this had been done, there was no retreating. A boundary had been reached which could not be crossed again till centuries had rolled away, and transformations of a more pretentious kind than any which had yet taken place had passed upon the Church. Chapter 3. Development of the Papacy from Constantine. Imperial edicts. Prestige of some. Fall of the Western Empire. The Papacy seeks to find a new basis of power. Christ's vicar. Conversion of Gothic nations. Pepin and Charlemagne. The Lombards and the Saracens. Forgeries and false decretals. Election of the Roman Pontiff. Before opening our great theme, it may be needful to sketch the rise and development of the papacy as a political ecclesiastical power. The history on which we are entering, and which we must rapidly traverse, is one of the most wonderful in the world. It is scarcely possible to imagine humbler beginnings than those from which the papacy arose, and certainly it is not possible to imagine a loftier height than to which it eventually climbed. He who was seen in the first century presiding as the humble pastor over a single congregation and claiming no rank above his brethren is beheld in the 12th century occupying a seat from which he looks down on all the thrones, temporal and spiritual, of Christendom. How, we might ask with amazement, was the papacy able to traverse the mighty space that divided the humble pastor from the mitred king? We traced in the foregoing chapter the decay of doctrine and manners within the Church. Among the causes which were contributed to the exaltation of the papacy, this declension may be ranked as fundamental, seeing it open the door for other deteriorating influences, and mightily favored their operation. Instead of reaching forth to what was before, the Christian Church permitted herself to be overtaken by the spirit of the ages that lay behind her. There came and later growth of Jewish ritualism, of Greek philosophy, and of pagan ceremonialism and idolatry, and as the consequence of this threefold action, the clergy began to gradually change, as already mentioned, from a teaching ministry to a sacrificing priesthood. This made them no longer ministers or servants to their fellow Christians. They took the position of a caste, claiming to be superior to the laity, invested with mysterious powers, the channels of grace, and the mediators with God. Thus there arose a hierarchy, assuming to mediate between God and man. The hierarchical polity was the natural concomitant of the hierarchical doctrine. That polity was so consolidated by the time that the empire became Christian and Constantine ascended the throne, 311, that the church now stood out as a body distinct from the state, and her new organization, subsequently received in imitation of that empire, as stated in the previous chapter, helped still further to define and strengthen her hierarchical government. Still, the primacy of Rome was then a thing unheard of. Manifestly, the 300 fathers who assembled at Nicaea, 325, knew nothing of it, for in their 6th and 7th canons they expressly recognized the authority of the churches of Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and others, each within its own boundaries, even as Rome had just jurisdiction within its limits, and enact that jurisdiction and privileges of these churches shall be retained. Under Leo the Great, 440 to 461, a forward step was taken. The Church of Rome assumed the form and exercised the sway of an ecclesiastical principality, while her head, in virtue of an imperial manifesto, of Valentine III, which recognized the Bishop of Rome as supreme over the Western Church, affected the authority and pomp of a spiritual sovereign. Still further, the ascent of the Bishop of Rome to the supremacy was silently, yet powerfully aided by that mysterious and subtle influence which appeared to be indigenous to the soil on which his chair was placed, an age when the rank of the city determined the rank of its pastor. It was natural that the Bishop of Rome should hold something of that preeminence among the clergy which Rome held among cities. Gradually the reverence and awe with which men had regarded the old mistress of the world began to gather round the person and chair of her bishop. It was an age of faction and strife, and the eyes of the contending parties naturally turned to the pastor of the Tiber. They craved his advice, or they submitted their differences to his judgment. These applications the Roman bishop was careful to register as acknowledgments of his superiority, and on fitting occasions he was not forgetful to make them the basis of new and higher claims. The Latin race, moreover, retained the practical habits for which it had so long been renowned, and while the Eastern Church, giving way to their speculative genius, were expending their energies in controversy, the Western Church was steadily pursuing her onward path, and skillfully availing herself of everything that could tend to enhance her influence and extend her jurisdiction. The removal of the seat of the empire from Rome to the splendid city on the Bosphorus, Constantinople, which the emperor had built with becoming magnificence for his residence, also tended to enhance the power of the papal chair. It removed from the side of the pope a functionary by whom he was eclipsed, and left him the first person in the old capital of the world. The emperor had departed, but the prestige of the old city, the fruit of countless victories and of ages of dominion, had not departed. The contest, which had been going on for some time among the 5 great patriarchs, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Rome, the question at issue being the same as that which provoked the contention among the disciples of old, which was the greatest, was now restricted to the last 2. The city on the Bosphorus was the seat of government and the abode of the emperor. This gave her patriarch powerful claims. But the city on the banks of the Tiber wielded a mysterious and potent charm over the imagination, as the heir of her who had been the possessor of all power, of all the glory, and of all the dominion of the past, and this vast prestige enabled her enabled her patriarch to carry the day. As Rome was the one city in the earth, so her bishop was the one bishop in the church. A century and a half later, 606, this preeminence was decreed to the Roman bishop by an imperial edict of Focus. Thus, before the Empire of the West fell, the Bishop of Rome had established substantially his spiritual supremacy, an influence of a manifold kind, of which not the least part was the prestige of the city and the empire, had lifted him to this fatal preeminence. But now the time has come when the empire must fall, and we expect to see that supremacy, which had so largely helped to build up, fall with it. But no, the wave of barbarism which rolled in from the north, overwhelming society and sweeping away the empire, broke harmlessly at the feet of the Bishop of Rome. The shocks that overturned dynasties and blotted out nationalities left his power untouched, his seat unshaken. Nay, it was at that very hour when society was perishing around him that the Bishop of Rome laid anew the foundation of his power, and placed them where they might remain immovable for all time. He now cast himself on a far stronger element than any the revolution had swept away. He now claimed to be the successor of Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, and the Vicar of Christ. The canons of councils, as recorded in Harduin, show a stream of decisions from Pope Celestine in the middle of the 5th century to Pope Boniface II in the middle of the 6th, claiming directly or indirectly this august prerogative. When the Bishop of Rome placed his chair, with all the prerogatives and dignities vested in it, upon this ground, he stood no longer upon a merely imperial foundation. Henceforward, he held neither of Caesar nor of Rome. He held immediately of heaven. What one emperor had given, another emperor might take away. It did not suit the Pope to hold his office by so uncertain a tenure. He made haste, therefore, to place his supremacy where no future decree of emperor, no lapse of years, and no coming revolution could overturn it. He claimed to rest it upon a divine foundation. He claimed to be not merely the chief of bishops and the first of patriarchs, but the vicar of the Most High God. With the assertion of this dogma, the system of the papacy was completed essentially and doctrinally, but not as yet practically. It had to wait the full development of the idea of vicarship, which was not till the days of Gregory VII. But here we have the embryonic seed, the vicarship, namely, out of which the vast structure of the papacy has sprung. This is that plants at the center of the system a pseudo-divine jurisdiction, and places the Pope above all bishops with their flocks, above all kings with their subjects. This it is that gives the Pope 2 swords. This it is that gives him 3 crowns. The day when this dogma was proclaimed was the true birthday of the popedom. The Bishop of Rome had till now sat in the seat of Caesar. Henceforward he was to sit in the seat of God. From this time the growth of the popedom was rapid indeed. The state of society favored its development. Night had descended upon the world from the north, and in the universal barbarism, the more prodigious any pretensions were, the more likely were they to find both belief and submission. The Goths, on arriving in their new settlements, beheld a religion which was served by magnificent cathedrals, imposing rites, and wealthy and powerful prelates, presided over by a chief priest, in whose reputed sanctity and ghostly authority they found again their own chief druid. These rude warriors, who had overturned the throne of the Caesars, bowed down before the chair of the popes. The evangelization of these tribes was a task of easy accomplishment. The Catholic faith, which they began to exchange for their paganism and Arianism, consisted chiefly in their being able to recite the names of the objects of their worship, which they were left to adore with much the same rites as they had practiced in their native forests. They did not much concern themselves with the study of Christian doctrine or the practice of Christian virtue. The age furnished but a few manuals of the one, and still fewer models of the other. The first of the Gothic princes to enter the Roman communion was Clovis, king of the Franks, in fulfillment of a vow which he had made in the field of Tolbiac. Where he vanquished the Alemanni, Clovis was baptized in the Cathedral of Rheims 496, with every circumstance of solemnity which could impress a sense of the awfulness of the rite on the minds of its rude proselytes. 3,000 of his warlike subjects were baptized along with him. The Pope styled him the eldest son of the Church, a title which was regularly adopted by all the subsequent kings of France. When Clovis ascended from the baptismal font, he was the only as well as the eldest son of the Church, for he alone, of all the new chiefs that now governed the West, had as yet submitted to the baptismal rite. And we're going to have to pick up here next time in our history of Protestantism. It's doing that because I've run out of time. So I'm going to say, well, may the Almighty bless you and keep you as you travel on the narrow way that leads to life. I'll see you next time. Don't forget to share the video, like the video, and all that stuff. Tell a friend about First Amendment Radio. Share a link to our Mobi page with all of your friends and all of your contacts. We need your help. If you don't have money, these are a few things that you can do for us that will cost you nothing but a few moments of your time. If you have money and you're giving to other ministries, well, keep giving where God tells you to give. But if you're looking for a place to give, please consider prayerfully giving to help support First Amendment Radio and the work we are doing here. Well, God bless you all and have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. firstamendmentradio.net/MOBI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. firstamendmentradio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.